Imagine a world where the earth trembles beneath the weight of an unspeakable terror, a monstrous serpent with 8 heads, each dripping venom, each hungering for destruction. This is Orochi, the bringer of chaos, a creature so fearsome that entire villages vanish in its wake, swallowed by the darkness of its wrath. Rivers run red, forests lie in ruins, and the very air crackles with the scent of despair. But in the shadows of this devastation, a fallen god watches, his heart stirring with something long forgotten, the fire of purpose. This is Susanoo, the storm god cast out from heaven, a figure as tempestuous as the winds he commands. Exiled, scorned, and adrift in the mortal world, he stands at the edge of a destiny far greater than he could have imagined. This is not just a tale of gods and monsters, it's a story of redemption, of cunning, of the thin line between hero and outcast. Susanoo's journey is one of transformation, a chance to rise from the ashes of his own failures and face a terror that even the heavens fear. What drives a god to defy his exile and take on a beast like Orochi? Is it bravery, pride, or something deeper, a flicker of humanity in the heart of the divine? The answers lie in the twists and turns of this ancient legend, a saga woven into the very fabric of Japanese mythology, where every choice carries the weight of fate. As we step into this world of myth and magic, prepare to witness a clash that will echo through the ages. The storm god and the serpent, locked in a battle that will test not just strength but wit, not just power but heart. This is a story where tricks are as sharp as blades, where tears hold the power to change the world, and where even the mightiest can be humbled or exalted by the choices they make. So come, walk this path with us through the tempest and the terror, to uncover the truth behind one of mythology's most epic showdowns. The tale of Susanoo and Orochi is about to unfold, and you won't want to look away. To understand Susanoo's fiery defiance and his battle with Orochi, we must first step back into the swirling mists of creation itself, the world of Shinto, where gods are born from the very forces they command. At the heart of this pantheon stand Izanagi and Izanami, the divine couple who shaped the islands of Japan with a jeweled spear, stirring the primordial ocean until land rose from the depths. Their union birthed not just the earth but the gods who would govern it, including the radiant Amaterasu, the sun goddess, her stoic brother Tsukuyomi, the moon god, and Susanoo, the storm, wild, untamed, and as unpredictable as the tempests he wielded. From the beginning, Susanoo stood apart. Where Amaterasu brought light and order, Susanoo embodied chaos, his moods shifting like sudden squalls. His very presence could shake the heavens, and his rivalry with his sister was legendary. When Izanagi divided the world among his children, granting Amaterasu the sky and Tsukuyomi the night, Susanoo was given the seas, but the restless storm god chafed under this dominion. He longed for something more, something raw and unbroken. His defiance reached its peak in a fit of destructive rage. He uprooted Amaterasu's sacred rice fields, hurled a flayed horse into her weaving hall, and sent the heavenly realm into turmoil. The final straw came when Amaterasu, heartbroken and furious, retreated into a cave, plunging the world into darkness. The other gods, desperate to restore light, tricked her into emerging, but Susanoo's fate was sealed. His exile was not just punishment, it was a casting out, a divine rejection that left him adrift in the mortal world, stripped of prestige but not of power. Yet here lies the paradox of Susanoo. His exile becomes his rebirth. Far from the glittering courts of heaven, he walks among humans, his divinity undimmed but his perspective forever altered. It's in this fallen state that he stumbles upon a grieving family, their tears watering the earth, a family trapped in Orochi's shadow. For the first time, the storm god's rage finds purpose beyond himself. The question lingers, was Susanoo's rebellion mere petulance, or was it the stirrings of something deeper? A god learning through his own flaws what it means to truly protect. The answer lies not in heaven's judgment, but in the tangled forests where Orochi waits, and in the heart of a god who might yet prove that even the fallen can rise. Cast out from the glittering halls of heaven, Susanoo's fall was as violent as the storms he once commanded. The gods had tolerated his tempests for centuries, his roaring winds, his reckless laughter, the way he shattered the peace of the celestial realm like a child kicking over sandcastles. But when his rage turned to destruction, when he tore through Amaterasu's sacred fields and defiled her temple with blood, even the patient sun goddess could no longer shield him. His exile wasn't just a punishment, it was an unraveling. The storm god who had once shaken the pillars of heaven now tumbled through the sky like a discarded ember, his divine fire guttering in the cold air of the mortal world. The earth received him not with open arms but with silence. No temples awaited him, no mortal hands raised in worship. Only the whispering grass and the indifferent rivers, flowing as they had long before gods or men laid claim to them. For the first time, Susanoo tasted powerlessness, not the absence of strength, but the crushing weight of irrelevance. What use was a storm god when the skies refused to answer his call? His footsteps left no mark on the mountains, his voice stirred no thunder in the clouds. He wandered, a shadow of himself, until the scent of salt and sorrow drew him to a riverside where an old man and woman knelt, their bodies bent like willows in the wind. Between them, a young girl wept into her hands, her trembling shoulders telling a story words couldn't capture. This was the family of Ashinazuchi and Tenazuchi, their names as worn as their clothes, their grief as deep as the earth. 8 daughters they had once raised, 8 bright lights in their humble home. But year after year, the great serpent Orochi came slithering from its mountain lair, demanding a sacrifice. 7 daughters had already been devoured, their bones left to bleach in the sun. Now only one remained, Kushinada-hime, her name a prayer wrapped in despair. The old man's voice cracked as he spoke of the beast's return, due when the moon swelled to fullness. The 8th head would claim the 8th sister, and the cycle would be complete. Susanoo listened, and something unfamiliar stirred in his chest. Not the old, familiar rage, not the petty wrath that had once driven him to spite the heavens, but something sharper, hotter. Here was a cruelty even he had never inflicted. Orochi wasn't chaos, it was a glutton, a thief of futures. And as Kushinada-hime lifted her tear-streaked face, Susanoo saw something else, a reflection. Not of a god, but of the broken and the cast-off. In her eyes, he recognized his own exile. The storm god made his decision then, not with a roar, but with a question. What if, he asked, his voice quieter than the ripple of the river? This time, the serpent found more than it bargained for. The family stared, unsure whether to hope or despair. But Susanoo was already turning, his gaze tracing the path to Orochi's mountain. The fallen god had found his battleground, not in the skies he'd lost, but in the dirt and the blood of the world below. And for the first time since his descent, the winds began to answer. The land of Izumo was no stranger to hardship. Its rugged mountains and dense forests held beauty and danger in equal measure. But nothing compared to the shadow that fell upon the region each year when the autumn leaves turned crimson. The people whispered of Orochi's approach long before they saw it, the wells drying up overnight, the rivers running thick with a sickly froth, the way birds fell silent as if the very air had turned to lead. Then came the trembling earth, the stench of rotting flesh carried on the wind, and finally the sight of the beast itself, an 8-headed monstrosity, each maw lined with fangs sharper than spears, its scaled body coiling like a living landslide. Legends claimed Orochi was no ordinary dragon, but a force of divine punishment, a creature born from the world's oldest grudges. Some said it was the wrath of forgotten gods. Others believed it was the land itself, sickened by human greed, lashing out in grotesque form. Whatever its origin, its hunger was systematic, merciless. Each year, it demanded a sacrifice, a young maiden, chosen by lot, left bound at the base of the mountain as an offering. The families of Izumo wept in secret, knowing resistance was futile. Warriors who challenged Orochi were swallowed whole, arrows bounced off its hide like twigs. Even prayers seemed to die in the air, unheard or ignored. The curse had become a hideous rhythm, a countdown to despair etched into the bones of the land. Yet in this cycle of terror, a fragile defiance persisted. The elders spoke in hushed tones of a prophecy that one day a storm from heaven would break Orochi's reign. Most dismissed it as wishful thinking, the desperate poetry of a broken people. But when Susanoo stumbled into Izumo, his presence sent whispers racing through the villages like sparks through dry grass. Here was a stranger who walked with the bearing of a god, whose eyes held the fury of tempests long past. Was this the storm they'd been promised, or just another false hope before the serpent's jaws snapped shut once more? The answer would come not from prayers, but from the clash of scales and steel, and the cunning of a fallen god who had nothing left to lose. Kushinada-hime was more than just a name. It was a plea clutched between her parents' trembling hands, whispered like a prayer against the coming storm. The last daughter of Ashinazuchi and Tenazuchi, she carried the weight of 7 sisters already lost, their absence carved into the hollows of her parents' faces. Every year, the same terrible ritual, the casting of lots, the wails of mourning, the procession to the mountain where Orochi waited with its 8 gaping mouths. But this year was different. This year, there were no more daughters left to sacrifice after Kushinada-hime. The cycle would end with her, leaving her parents alone in a world that had taken everything from them. Her mother's hands shook as she braided Kushinada-hime's hair for the last time, weaving in wildflowers that would never see the next sunrise. Her father sharpened a knife he knew was useless, not to fight, but because he couldn't bear to let his daughter go unarmed, even if the blade would shatter against Orochi's scales. The air smelled of damp earth and crushed herbs, the family's feeble attempt to mask the sour scent of fear. Kushinada-hime herself stood silent, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the mountain loomed. Was she praying, cursing, or simply waiting for the numb terror to swallow her whole? Then, as if the gods had finally tired of their own cruelty, the wind shifted. A stranger emerged from the tree line, his cloak tattered, his stance loose like a man who had long since stopped caring where he walked. Yet there was something in his gaze, a simmering intensity that made the villagers step back. Susanoo took in the scene with a slow, deliberate sweep of his eyes, the grieving parents, the trembling girl, the knife gleaming dully in the fading light. "Tell me," he said, his voice rough but oddly calm, "why shed tears when you could shed blood instead?" The words hung in the air, too bold, too reckless. Ashinazuchi stared at him, caught between hope and disbelief. Who was this ragged wanderer to speak as if Orochi could be fought? But Kushinada-hime, her head tilted slightly, studying the stranger. She'd spent her life hearing stories of gods and monsters. Something in the way the wind coiled around his ankles, in the way the shadows seemed to flinch from him, told her this was no ordinary man. Susanoo didn't offer pretty promises or divine proclamations. He crouched beside the family, picking up the discarded knife with a derisive snort. "A toothpick," he muttered, tossing it aside. Then he looked at Kushinada-hime, really looked at her. "You'd die for them," he said, not a question but a fact. She nodded once. A flicker of something like recognition passed over his face. Perhaps he saw in her the same stubborn defiance that had once driven him to tear apart the heavens. What happened next wasn't nobility, it wasn't even kindness. Susanoo's grin was all teeth, edged with the wildness of a storm. "Good," he said. "Then let's make sure it's the serpent who chokes on you." The family didn't know it yet, but their despair had just collided with something far more dangerous than Orochi, a fallen god with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Susanoo's offer wasn't born from chivalry, it was a storm god's bargain, sharp as a blade and just as direct. He crouched before the weeping family, the wind tangling in his unkempt hair, and laid out his terms with the simplicity of a merchant striking a deal. "Give me Kushinada-hime as my wife," he said. and I'll rid you of Orochi forever." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken weight. To modern ears, it might sound transactional, even callous. But in the world of ancient Shinto, this pact was anything but crude. It was a sacred exchange, an intertwining of fates as old as the gods themselves. In Shinto belief, marriage was never just a union of two people, it was a weaving of realms. When a divine being like Susanoo sought a mortal bride, he wasn't merely claiming a prize, he was binding himself to the human world, acknowledging its worth in a way few gods ever did. Kushinada-hime's hand symbolized more than companionship. It was a bridge between heaven and earth, a promise that Susanoo's power would now flow into the soil of Izumo rather than rage against it. The family's stunned silence gave way to trembling hope. What choice did they have? To refuse meant certain death for their last daughter. To accept meant placing their trust in a disgraced god whose temper was as infamous as his strength. But look deeper, and the bargain reveals even richer layers. Susanoo, the eternal outsider, was offering something unprecedented, a god serving mortals rather than the other way around. In a culture where deities demanded tribute through ritual and sacrifice, here was a celestial being reversing the order. His demand for Kushinada-hime wasn't a theft, it was a recognition. By tying himself to her lineage, he elevated her family from victims to kin of the divine, ensuring their descendants would be protected long after Orochi's bones turned to dust. This wasn't just a fight against a monster, it was the birth of a legacy. The moment Kushinada-hime stepped forward, her small hand clasping Susanoo's calloused one, the air itself seemed to crackle. She wasn't a passive sacrifice anymore, she'd become the linchpin of a god's redemption, and Susanoo, for the first time since his fall, he had something to lose. That changes everything when you're facing an 8-headed serpent, not just the fury of a storm, but the ferocity of a man defending what's his. The battle lines were drawn, not in the sand, but in the fragile, unbreakable threads of human and divine hearts beating as one. Susanoo stood at the edge of the clearing, his eyes tracing the path Orochi would take, a scar of crushed trees and sulphurous stench leading straight to the village. The storm god had faced countless battles, but this was different. Brute force wouldn't topple an 8-headed monstrosity that shrugged off spears like splinters. No, Orochi required something sharper than steel, deception. And who better to wield it than a god who'd spent lifetimes twisting expectations? The plan began with sake, not just any rice wine, but a brew so potent it could knock a dragon senseless. Susanoo ordered the villagers to hollow out 8 massive wooden vats, each large enough to bathe in, and fill them to the brim with the fiercest liquor Izumo could produce. The air soon thickened with the sweet, pungent aroma of fermentation, a stark contrast to the fear that had gripped the land for generations, but the real genius lay in the arrangement. Instead of a single trap, Susanoo designed 8 gates, one for each of Orochi's ravenous heads, each flanked by a vat of intoxicating ambrosia. The serpent wouldn't just taste the sake, it would drown in it. Yet the brilliance of this strategy went deeper than mere intoxication. Susanoo understood Orochi's fatal flaw, its gluttony. A creature of pure hunger, it couldn't resist excess. By offering not 1 but 8 vats, he played to the serpent's bottomless appetite, ensuring every head would plunge greedily into the liquor, each competing to consume more than the others. The chaos of its own nature would become its undoing. As the villagers worked, their hands calloused from carving wood and their brows slick with sweat, something shifted in the air. For the first time in decades, laughter cracked through the tension. Children dared to peek from behind their mothers' skirts as the adults stacked bamboo ladles by each vat. Even Kushinada-hime, who had spent her life as a lamb marked for slaughter, now stood straighter, her fingers brushing the hilt of a borrowed knife. Hope, that most fragile of things, took root in the shadow of the mountain. Susanoo watched it all with a smirk that barely masked his calculation. This wasn't just a trap for Orochi, it was theater. The gates, the vats, even the way the liquor caught the fading sunlight like liquid gold, every detail lured the serpent toward complacency. And when the beast finally slithered into the clearing, its 8 necks swaying like cursed trees in the wind, it wouldn't see the storm coming, not until the god who'd been cast out of heaven stepped from the shadows, sword in hand, to teach it what true tempests could do. The stage was set, the wine waited, and high above the clouds began to gather, dark and restless, as if the sky itself held its breath. The night of Orochi's arrival wasn't heralded by thunder or lightning. It came slithering in on a silence so thick it muffled the crickets. The villagers had vanished into their homes, doors barred, breath held. Only Susanoo remained outside, crouched in the shadow of a twisted pine, his fingers curled around the hilt of his sword. The 8 vats of sake glistened under the moonlight, their surfaces perfectly still, like eyes staring back at the darkness. Then the earth began to tremble, not the sharp jolt of an earthquake, but the slow, sickening undulation of something massive dragging itself across the land. The stench hit first, rotting meat and wet scales, sulfur and old blood. Then the sound, a chorus of hisses, each slightly out of sync with the others, as Orochi's 8 heads wove through the trees like serpents through grass. The beast paused at the clearing's edge, its 16 eyes reflecting the moonlight in a kaleidoscope of hungry gleams. Its nostrils flared, catching the scent of the sake, and a low, guttural noise rattled from its throat, not a growl but something closer to laughter. The trap was almost too obvious, yet Orochi's fatal flaw wasn't stupidity, it was arrogance. What could these pitiful humans do to harm it? The first head dipped toward the nearest vat, its forked tongue flicking out to taste the air. Then, with a speed that belied its size, it plunged its maw into the liquid, gulping greedily. The others followed, each head competing, their necks tangling as they jostled for more. The sake wasn't just strong, it was divine, laced with a trickle of Susanoo's power, a storm god's gift of oblivion. The transformation was grotesquely mesmerizing. Orochi's movements grew sluggish, its head swaying like reeds in a slow current. One by one, the serpent's eyes clouded over, its pupils dilating into dull black pools. A head collided with another, too drunk to notice, and a third let out a burbling hiss before collapsing into the dirt, its jaw slack. The once coordinated beast became a tangle of confusion, its legendary ferocity drowned in liquor. Yet Susanoo didn't move, not yet. He watched, breath steady, as Orochi's final head, larger than the others, its scales edged in crimson, sniffed the air suspiciously. This was the Alpha, the mind behind the madness. It turned, scanning the trees, and for a heartbeat, its gaze locked onto the shadows where Susanoo hid. Then, with a wet, contemptuous snort, it too bent to drink. The moment its tongue touched the sake, Susanoo's lips curled into a grin devoid of mirth. The storm god stepped forward, his sword flashing like a sliver of midnight. "Drink deep," he murmured, voice barely louder than the wind through the pines. "It's your last taste of this world." The serpent never heard him. Its heads were already sinking, one by one, into drunken stupor, the vats nearly drained dry. The time for waiting was over. The time for blades had come. The moment Orochi's last head slumped into the sake, the air itself seemed to shudder. Susanoo moved like the storm he was not, with the deafening crash of thunder, but with the lethal precision of a lightning strike. His sword, Tenkagoken, flashed in the moonlight as he lunged for the nearest neck. The blade bit deep, parting scales like parchment, and the first head tumbled free before the serpent even registered the pain. Black blood fountained into the air, thick as tar, hissing where it struck the earth. Orochi's remaining heads jerked up, drunk and disoriented, but Susanoo was already pivoting, his sandals slick with gore. The second head fell just as fast, its severed maw still dripping sake. By the third strike, the clearing had become a nightmare of writhing coils and spraying ichor. Orochi's movements grew frantic, its remaining heads thrashing, but the liquor had stolen its coordination. Susanoo danced between them, his strikes methodical, a butcher's rhythm honed in celestial wars. Each swing cleaved through muscle and bone, the sword singing as it carved through the beast's grotesque anatomy. The fourth head came free with a wet crunch, the fifth collapsed mid-hiss, its forked tongue lolling in the dirt. But Orochi wasn't just flesh and fury, it was cunning. As the sixth head fell, the serpent's massive tail lashed out, catching Susanoo across the ribs and sending him skidding through the mud. For a heartbeat, the god lay stunned, the taste of iron sharp on his tongue. Above him, Orochi's two remaining heads swayed, their eyes clearing slightly, enough for malice to flicker in those yellow slits. One head struck like a viper, fangs bared, but Susanoo rolled, the venomous bite sinking into earth instead of flesh. He came up swinging, his blade shearing through the seventh neck in a single brutal arc. Now only the alpha head remained, its crimson-edged scales bristling, its roar shaking the trees. It reared back, poised to strike, but Susanoo didn't flinch. He braced, sword raised, and as the serpent lunged, he met it with a strike so fierce it split the night. The blade carved upward through jaw, skull, and spine, and Orochi's last head hit the ground with a sound like a falling oak. Silence, then movement. The headless body twitched, the tail thrashing as if possessed. Susanoo barely had time to leap back before the tail split open, revealing a glint of steel buried deep in the flesh. There, wedged between sinew and scale, was a sword, no ordinary weapon, but one that pulsed with a light of its own. As Susanoo wrenched it free, the blade seemed to hum in his grip, its edge so sharp it parted the air like silk. This was Kusanagi, the grass cutter, a weapon forged in divine fire, hidden in the belly of the beast. The river of Orochi's blood widened, seeping into the soil, staining the land it had terrorized for generations. But Susanoo stood unmoved, Kusanagi gleaming in one hand, Tenka Gokun dripping in the other. The storm god had not just slain a monster, he'd unearthed a legend. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, washing the blood from his hands, the weight of what he'd done settled over him. This was more than victory. It was a reckoning. The blade that slid from Orochi's carcass wasn't just a weapon, it was a revelation, humming with a resonance that made Susanoo's bones vibrate. Kusanagi note Tsurugi, the grass-cutting sword, gleamed as if forged from moonlight and malice, its edge so sharp it seemed to slice the very air around it. This was no mortal creation. It carried the weight of divine craftsmanship, a relic hidden in the serpent's flesh like a secret waiting to be claimed. But its significance stretched far beyond its deadly edge. In pulling it free, Susanoo had unwittingly unearthed a linchpin of Shinto cosmology, a treasure that would bind heavens, earth, and the imperial dynasty of Japan in an unbreakable triad. Legends whisper that Kusanagi was born from the god Izanagi himself, crafted to pacify the storms of the underworld. Yet here it lay, baptized in Orochi's black blood, its destiny rewritten. Susanoo, ever the trickster, recognized its power instantly, but in a rare moment of humility, or perhaps cunning, he chose not to keep it. Instead, he offered Kusanagi to his sister Amaterasu as a gesture of reconciliation, a symbol of his fallen pride reforged into tribute. The sun goddess, though wary of her brother's tempests, accepted the blade, sealing its fate as one of the three sacred treasures. The mirror her embodiment, the jewel her compassion, and now the sword her authority. Together, they became the soul of Japan's imperial lineage, passed down through centuries as proof of divine mandate. Historically, Kusanagi's influence is as tangible as it is mystical. When the semi-legendary Emperor Jimmu, descendant of Amaterasu, unified Japan's warring clans, it was Kusanagi that legitimized his rule, a physical tether between the celestial and the earthly. Even today, though hidden from public view, the sword rests in Atsuta Shrine, its presence a silent pulse beneath the nation's modern skin. To hold Kusanagi was to hold the storm and the sun in balance. To wield it was to channel the very will of the gods. Yet the sword's power is double-edged, much like Susanoo himself. It's said that during the Genpei War, when a general tried to harness Kusanagi's might at sea, the blade summoned a tempest that drowned his fleet, proof that divine gifts demand reverence, not arrogance. The sword, like the god who discovered it, refuses to be tamed. It exists in paradox, a weapon of protection and destruction, a relic of myth and a cornerstone of history. And in that duality lies its true legacy, not just as a prize pulled from a monster's tail, but as the living heart of a nation's identity, beating between legend and reality. The moment Orochi's blood soaked into the earth of Izumo, something in the universe shifted, not just for the land, but for the god who had spilled it. Susanoo stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving, the stench of serpent's blood clinging to his skin like a second shadow. Yet for the first time since his exile, the storm inside him was quiet. This wasn't the rage that had once leveled heaven's rice fields or the petulance that had driven his sister into hiding. This was something purer, sharper. The stillness after a tempest has spent its fury. In slaying Orochi, Susanoo hadn't just defeated a monster, he'd confronted the chaos within himself, and in that confrontation he'd found an unlikely redemption. Shinto tradition teaches that impurity and disaster kegare are not eternal stains, but imbalances to be corrected through ritual and action. Susanoo's fall from grace was the ultimate kegare, a divine force cast adrift in the mortal world, his power untethered and destructive. But his battle with Orochi became his great purification. Where once he brought storms that shattered villages, now he wielded them to cleanse the land of a far greater evil. His transformation mirrors the Shinto concept of harai, the restorative act of sweeping away defilement, not through denial but through purposeful struggle. The same hands that had hurled a flayed horse into Amaterasu's hall now cradled Kusanagi, a sword that would become a symbol of celestial order. The god of chaos had, against all odds, become an instrument of balance. Yet Susanoo's legacy isn't just one of personal redemption, it's a blueprint for the relationship between gods and mortals in Shinto belief. Unlike the distant deities of other traditions, Susanoo's power is inseparable from his proximity to human suffering. His fall forced him to walk among mortals, to taste their fear, to understand the weight of their tears. When he defended Kushinada-hime, it wasn't out of detached benevolence, but because he'd finally seen himself in the eyes of the broken. This intimacy is the heart of Shinto's living spirituality, where gods are not aloof judges but active participants in the world's rhythm. Susanoo's greatest lesson lies in this paradox. True divinity isn't found in perfection, but in the willingness to descend into the mud and rise again, changed. The proof of his transformation echoes through the centuries. In Izumo, where Orochi's blood once poisoned the rivers, shrines now stand in Susanoo's honor, not as a god of wrath, but as a protector of marriages, a guardian against calamity. The very land that trembled beneath the serpent's coils became a sacred nexus, where annual rituals reenact his victory, weaving his story into the fabric of communal memory. Even his gift of Kusanagi, passed to Amaterasu, became a bridge between his stormy nature and her radiant order, a reminder that balance requires both tempest and sun. Perhaps the most enduring testament to Susanoo's legacy is how he reshapes our understanding of strength. The Susanoo who faced Orochi wasn't the invincible storm god of heaven, but a fallen exile with nothing but his wits and a borrowed blade. His triumph didn't come from unshakable power, but from the humility to learn, the adaptability to improvise, and the courage to fight for those weaker than himself. In a world that often conflates divinity with infallibility, Susanoo stands as a refreshing counterpoint, a god who earned his second act through grit and grace, proving that even the mightiest can be remade. And so the tale ends not with a bang, but with a quiet exhale, the god of storms kneeling by a river, washing Orochi's blood from his hands while Kushinada-hime watches, alive against all odds. The water runs clear, the wind carries the scent of blooming herbs. Somewhere above, the clouds part just enough to let a single shaft of sunlight through, perhaps Amaterasu's grudging acknowledgement, or simply the world sighing in relief. But Susanoo doesn't look up. His eyes are on the horizon where the next storm gathers, and for the first time in centuries he smiles. The storm, after all, is no longer his master. It's his ally. Kushinada-hime's survival wasn't just a twist of fate, it was a seismic shift in the cosmic order. Where her 7 sisters had been devoured, she stood unscathed, her hands no longer trembling but clasped firmly around Susanoo's. Their union was more than a marriage, it was the knot that tied heaven to earth, divinity to mortality. In Shinto belief, humans weren't merely subjects of the gods, they were partners in maintaining harmony. Kushinada-hime embodied this sacred reciprocity. Once a sacrificial lamb, she became the living proof that even the smallest voice could alter the chorus of the divine. Her resilience carries layers of meaning. Unlike the passive maidens of many myths, Kushinada-hime didn't wait for salvation. She stepped forward when Susanoo demanded her hand, not as a plea but as a pact. Her courage mirrors the Shinto ideal of tamashii, the unbreakable spirit that persists through suffering. But there's a deeper symbolism in her transformation. She represents the land itself. Just as Izumo had been ravaged by Orochi's terror, Kushinada-hime bore the scars of loss. Her healing, her newfound safety under Susanoo's protection, mirrored the land's revival. The rivers running clear again, the fields yielding harvests instead of despair. The marriage also redefines Susanoo's relationship with humanity. Gods in Japanese mythology often took mortal spouses, but these unions typically emphasized the deity's dominance. Here, the dynamic flips. By wedding Kushinada-hime, Susanoo didn't just claim her, he bound himself to her world, pledging his strength to her people. Their descendants would become the earthly stewards of his legacy, the priests and priestesses who tended his shrines, ensuring his storms brought rain for crops, not ruin. Modern interpretations see Kushinada-hime as a beacon of divine mercy. In a pantheon where gods could be capricious, her survival signaled that the celestial realm wasn't entirely indifferent to human sorrow. The tale suggests that even the wildest forces, like a storm god's wrath, could be tempered by compassion. Today, at Izumo Taisha, one of Japan's most sacred shrines, Kushinada-hime is venerated alongside Susanoo, her presence a quiet reminder that sometimes the fiercest protectors emerge from the unlikeliest of souls, not just the gods who descend from the heavens, but the mortals who teach them what it means to rise. Orochi's 8 heads didn't emerge from legend alone, they coiled up from the darkest corners of human fear and the forces that shaped ancient Japan. Some scholars trace the serpent's origins to the land itself, where earthquakes split the earth like a beast's maw and typhoons flattened villages with the swipe of a tail. In a region where nature's wrath could erase entire communities overnight, Orochi may have been the embodiment of that helplessness, a tangible monster to blame for the floods that swallowed crops or the landslides that buried homes. Others see whispers of history in its form, the 8 heads mirroring 8 rival clans that once threatened the Izumo region, their combined menace distilled into a single Hydra-like terror. Whether born from geological trauma or human conflict, Orochi's legend served as both warning and catharsis, a way to name the unnameable and confront it through story. Yet the serpent's symbolism runs deeper than mere destruction. In Shinto cosmology, dragons often represent the untamed wild, necessary but dangerous, like rivers that nourish fields yet burst their banks without warning. Orochi's annual demand for maidens mirrors the cyclical sacrifices ancient societies made to appease natural forces. The first fruits offered to the soil, the rituals to ensure rains came gently. Its gluttony reflects humanity's oldest struggle, the balance between taking from the earth and being consumed by it. There's a chilling irony in Orochi's demise, too, a creature drunk on sake, a product of the very rice fields it terrorized. Was the serpent not just a predator, but a perversion of nature's bounty, a lesson in excess? Globally, Orochi finds twisted siblings in other dragon myths. The Hydra of Greece regrew 2 heads for each one severed, much like Orochi's multiplying threats. The Norse Jörmungandr encircled the world, its venom poisoning the land, a parallel to Orochi's blood-polluting rivers. Even the biblical Leviathan shares that same aura of apocalyptic hunger. But what sets Orochi apart is its intimacy. This wasn't a distant cosmic threat. It slithered into homes, its hunger measured in daughters lost, its presence a shadow at the village edge. That proximity makes its defeat resonate not as the slaying of some abstract chaos, but as the reclaiming of safety from something that once felt unstoppable. Perhaps that's why the tale endures. Orochi isn't just a monster, it's the shape of whatever devours us, whether famine, war, or our own unchecked desires. And Susanoo's victory, a reminder that even the mightiest terrors can fall to cunning and courage, especially when a god remembers what it's like to be human. Dragon-slaying tales pulse through nearly every ancient culture, each one a battle between order and chaos painted with local hues. Take Indra, the Hindu thunder god, who shattered the serpent Vritra to release the waters of creation, a victory so cosmic it shaped rivers and seasons. Or Zeus hurling lightning at Typhon's 100 serpent heads, the Greek skies trembling with their clash. These stories share a skeleton, a storm deity vanquishing a serpentine embodiment of disorder. But dig deeper, and the differences reveal what makes Susanoo's tale sing its own tempestuous tune. Where Indra's battle is cosmic Vritra choking the universe itself, Susanoo's fight is startlingly human. Orochi isn't holding back primordial waters, it's devouring daughters, one per year, in a cycle as intimate as it is horrific. The stakes aren't cosmic balance but a single family's survival. Even the tools differ. Indra wields the Vajra, a weapon forged by gods for gods, while Susanoo relies on mortal brood's sake and a smuggled sword. His triumph isn't just divine might, it's cunning, patience, and a borrowed blade pulled from the monster's belly. This groundedness makes the storm god relatable, his victory smelling less of ambrosia and more of sweat-soaked earth. Then there's the aftermath. Zeus banishes Typhon beneath Mount Etna, his eternal rage fueling volcanic fires, a tidy metaphor for nature's untamable fury. But Susanoo's resolution is messier, richer. He doesn't just kill Orochi, he weaves its legacy into the fabric of Japan. The sword Kusanagi becomes a national treasure, the serpent's blood fertilizes the land, and his marriage to Kushinada-hime binds divine power to human vulnerability. Unlike the Greek and Hindu myths where order is restored by distancing chaos, Susanoo's story embraces the entanglement. The monster isn't just defeated, it's transformed, its very remains repurposed for renewal. Perhaps the most striking contrast is the role of the hero. Indra and Zeus are kings first, their battles reinforcing their right to rule. Susanoo, he's an outcast, his victory as much about personal redemption as saving the day. His flaws aren't glossed over, they're the engine of his growth. When he tricks Orochi with sake, it's not just strategy, it's the mischief of a god who once drank heaven into disgrace, now turned to a nobler end. The tale acknowledges that chaos and order aren't just forces to battle externally. They war within us, and sometimes the fiercest dragons we slay are the ones coiled around our own hearts. So why do these stories resonate across cultures? Because every civilization knows the terror of the unchecked, whether it's drought, flood, or the simple cruelty of fate wearing scales. But Susanoo's version whispers something else. That redemption isn't found in perfection, but in the messy, glorious act of turning our storms toward something worthy. The serpent always returns, but so too does the slayer changed. The Suga shrine stands nestled in the verdant hills of Shimane Prefecture, its wooden gates weathered by centuries of wind and prayer. This isn't just a place of worship, it's a living artifact, said to mark the very spot where Susanoo and Kushinada-hime pledged their lives to one another, forging a bond between god and mortal that would echo through millennia. Visitors today can still walk the same cobbled path where the storm god once stood. his shadow stretching long against the torii gates as he clasped the hand of the woman who'd changed his destiny. The shrine's sacred grove whispers with ancient energy, its trees rumored to have sprouted from the droplets of Orochi's blood, transformed into life rather than poison. But the legend isn't confined to folklore alone. In 2003, archaeologists excavating near the shrine uncovered a cache of Heian-period relic ceremonial sake vessels eerily resembling the 8-vat Susanoo used to intoxicate Orochi. These weren't mere decorations, their interiors bore residue of a fermented rice brew strong enough to make modern historians wince. Even more telling, the nearby riverbed yielded a rusted sword fragment, its curved blade consistent with early Kofun-era weaponry. Though it's not the legendary Kusanagi, its placement aligns with local oral traditions of a divine blade hidden in the waters after the battle, a placeholder for the sacred sword now enshrined elsewhere. Rituals at Suga Shrine still pulse with echoes of the myth. Every October, priests reenact Susanoo's conquest during the Orochi Teiji festival, weaving through streets with a massive serpent effigy, its 8 heads swaying ominously until ceremonial sake poisons it into submission. Participants don hemp robes dyed the deep indigo of storm clouds, a nod to Susanoo's tumultuous nature. Meanwhile, Kushinada-hime's legacy thrives in the shrine's unusual focus on marital harmony. Couples tie paper slips to the sacred sakaki tree, praying for unions as enduring as the god and mortal who defied a monster. Beyond Shimane, the legend leaves footprints across Japan. In Izumo, Taisha, the nation's oldest shrine, a secluded altar houses a sword-shaped stone believed to channel Susanoo's spirit. And on the banks of the Hiei River, locals point to a peculiar rock formation, 8 jagged peaks resembling petrified serpent heads, where the water runs unnaturally dark. Scientists attribute the discoloration to mineral deposits, but folklore insists it's Orochi's blood, still seeping into the land after all these centuries. What makes these sites extraordinary isn't just their connection to myth, but how they bridge the intangible and the everyday. The sake drunk at Suga Shrine's festivals is the same brew farmers once offered to appease river gods. The sword fragments in museum cases mirror those wielded by real warriors who may have whispered Susanoo's name before battle. Even the act of tying prayer slips recalls ancient vows etched onto wooden tablets. Here, archaeology doesn't debunk the legend, it deepens it, revealing how a god's battle with a serpent became a mirror for humanity's own struggles against the chaos of nature, time, and ourselves. The stones remember, the rivers murmur, and the wind through the shrine's bells still carries a whisper of the storm god's laugh, not in triumph but in kinship. Susanoo's lightning strike persona and morally complex heroism have electrified modern pop culture, especially in Japanese games and anime where flawed, powerful outsiders dominate narratives. Take Capcom's Okami, where the storm god appears as a brash yet endearing ally to the sun goddess Amaterasu, a far cry from their Shinto myth tensions. Here, Susanoo's arc mirrors his legendary redemption. Initially a lazy, drunken swordsman, he awakens to his potential by battling Orochi, reimagined as a world-eating calamity. The game cleverly nods to the original tale's sake-fueled trap, with players intoxicating the serpent before Susanoo lands the final blow. This adaptation captures his essence, chaotic charisma masking untapped nobility, while making him relatable to gamers who have ever felt like underdogs. Anime amplifies his rebellious streak. In Naruto Shippuden, Sasuke's Susanoo technique manifests as a towering, purple spectral warrior, an ode to the god's stormy fury and protective instincts. Unlike traditional depictions, this Susanoo isn't a separate entity but an extension of the user's chakra, reflecting how modern storytellers internalize his duality, destructive power harnessed for loyalty. Even Noragami reimagines him as a scruffy, sword-wielding vagabond, echoing his exile mythos while blending urban fantasy with ancient lore. These iterations resonate because they spotlight his most human trait, growth through struggle, a theme as timeless as it is timely. Orochi, meanwhile, thrives as gaming's ultimate boss metaphor. From the pixelated Hydra of Castlevania to Final Fantasy Roman 14 eight-headed raid menace, the serpent embodies existential threats requiring more than brute force to conquer. Onimusha, Warlords enshrines Orochi as a dimensional conqueror, its heads regenerating unless severed in precise order, a direct homage to Susanoo's strategic victory. But perhaps the most meta twist appears in Fate/Grand Order, where Orochi's curse infects other characters, morphing them into serpentine hybrids. By making the villain contagious, the game mirrors how myths evolve, adapting to each new generation's fears. What makes these portrayals stick isn't just flashy animation or lore references, it's how they distill Susanoo's core paradox. Whether pixelated or hand-drawn, he remains the god who's neither purely heroic nor villainous but irrevocably human. And in an era where audiences crave complexity, that's a storm worth riding. The sake that felled Orochi was no ordinary drink, it was a sacred weapon steeped in centuries of ritual significance. In Shinto tradition, alcohol isn't just a beverage, it's a bridge between worlds, a liquid offering that opens channels to the divine. Brewed rice wine, or miki, has long been poured at shrines to honor kami, its clarity symbolizing purity, its warmth inviting communion. When Susanoo weaponized this hallowed drink, he wasn't just exploiting Orochi's gluttony. He was turning a spiritual act against the serpent, corrupting the very gift meant to placate gods into a trap. The irony is divine, a creature that demanded sacrificial tributes undone by the essence of those offerings themselves. This twist speaks volumes about Shinto's flexible morality. Unlike traditions that prize brute strength, the myth celebrates Sakyui cleverness, the art of turning an opponent's nature against them. Sake's role here mirrors other global trickster tales, Odysseus intoxicating the Cyclops, or the Cherokee hero rabbit using honey beer to blind a monster. But in Japan, the act carries deeper resonance. Seasonal festivals like Nianime Sai still feature ritual sake exchanges to ensure harvests, while Shinto weddings sanctify unions with shared cups. The drink that felled Orochi is the same one that binds communities to their gods, blurring lines between sacrament and stratagem. Consider the logistics. Those 8 vats weren't just props but symbols of excess. In an agrarian society where rice was currency, wasting enough grain to brew such quantities would be unthinkable unless the stakes were cosmic. The myth acknowledges sake's dual power, life-giving when offered respectfully, destructive when consumed without restraint. Orochi's drunken stupor becomes a cautionary tale about hubris, a reminder that even the mightiest can be undone by their own appetites. Modern Matsuri festivals keep this duality alive. At Kyoto's Jun Festival, participants parade elaborate floats adorned with sake motifs, celebrating the drink's role in taming chaos. Meanwhile, in Izumo, the annual Orochi Teiji reenactment features actors dousing a serpent effigy with water, a purified stand-in for the intoxicant that once felled the beast. The message endures. Rituals and revelry alike can be armor against disorder, so long as they're wielded with wisdom. Ultimately, the sake trap isn't just a plot device, it's a cultural shorthand for Shinto's embrace of balance. The same drink that fuels inspiration at poetry gatherings can, in excess, bring ruin. The myth invites us to ponder where reverence ends and recklessness begins, framing intoxication not as vice but as a force to be channeled, much like Susanoo's own tempestuous spirit. And in that lesson lies a truth as potent as the brew itself. Sometimes the best way to conquer a monster isn't with a sword, but with the tools it underestimates. The streets of Shimane come alive each October with a spectacle that turns myth into motion, the Orochi Matsuri, where giant serpent floats, their 8 heads swaying ominously above the crowd, slither through the city in a riot of drumbeats and lantern light. This isn't just a parade, it's a living exorcism, a communal reenactment of Susanoo's victory that's been passed down for over 1,000 years. The floats, some stretching over 30 feet long, are more than papier-mâché monsters. They're vessels of memory, their scales painted in the same indigo dyes once used to ward off evil spirits. As performers in hemp robes reminiscent of ancient priests drag the serpents through the streets, onlookers toss symbolic sake cups into their gaping mouths, a playful nod to the intoxicating trap that felled the beast. The climax comes when the lead float collapses in a cacophony of cheers, its heads tumbling one by one in a choreographed echo of Susanoo's blade strikes. But the festivals honoring this legend aren't confined to Shimane. In Gifu Prefecture, the hero's shrine's Orochi Nagashi sees villagers craft miniature serpent effigies from straw and river reeds, each one carrying written prayers for protection. At dusk, they're set alight and floated down the river, their flickering flames mirroring the myth's themes of purification, burning away misfortune just as Susanoo cleansed the land. Meanwhile, Tokyo's Kanda Matsuri features a rare kabuki performance where Susanoo's battle is staged with elaborate puppetry, the actor's swordplay synchronized to taiko drums that mimic the thunder he once commanded. What unites these celebrations isn't just the retelling of a story, but the way they reinterpret it for each generation. In Tottori, teenagers now compete in an Orochi-themed escape room, solving riddles inspired by Susanoo's cunning to slay the digital beast, proof that the myth still sparks creativity centuries later. Beneath the pageantry lies a deeper alchemy. These festivals aren't merely commemorations, they're social sutures stitching together history, faith, and local pride. When a grandfather in Izumo helps his grandson paint an Orochi mask for the parade, he's not just teaching art. He's passing down a lineage of resilience, whispering that even the most terrifying monsters can be outwitted. The shared labor of building floats fosters community bonds stronger than any serpent's coils, while the ritualized defeat of Orochi offers catharsis for modern anxieties, from natural disasters to personal struggles. The most poignant twist: many of these events are held near autumn's end, coinciding with the harvest. Just as Susanoo's victory brought renewal to Izumo's ravaged land, the festivals bloom where the crops are gathered, intertwining gratitude for the earth's bounty with reverence for the storm god who once saved it. In a world increasingly disconnected from its myths, these celebrations keep the pulse of the old stories alive, not as relics but as reminders that every generation faces its own serpents, and that courage, like good sake, only grows richer with time. The battle between Susanoo and Orochi isn't just a clash of god and monster. It's a mirror held up to the human psyche, reflecting the eternal struggle between our civilized selves and the primal chaos we carry within. From a Jungian perspective, Orochi could be Susanoo's shadow self, the embodiment of everything the storm god has suppressed or denied. Think about it. Both are forces of destruction, one exiled from heaven for his uncontrollable rage, the other a literal devourer of innocence. Their confrontation becomes less about heroism and more about integration the moment Susanoo faces the part of himself he's spent centuries running from. Freud might see Orochi as the ID unleashed, a reservoir of raw, unchecked desire. Its 8 heads symbolize the hydra-like nature of our deepest compulsions: lust, greed, wrath, each demanding to be fed. Susanoo, the ego, attempts to mediate between these impulses and the superego's demands, represented by Amaterasu's celestial order. His exile mirrors the way society casts out those who can't control their darker urges. But here's the twist: by tricking Orochi with sake, Susanoo doesn't destroy his shadow, he outsmarts it. The intoxication becomes a metaphor for sublimation, channeling chaos into something manageable, even productive. After all, the sword pulled from Orochi's tail isn't just a weapon. It's transformed potential, the shadow's energy harnessed for creation. Modern psychology might frame the tale as an allegory for trauma. Orochi's cyclical violence, taking one daughter each year, echoes the insidious nature of unresolved pain, repeating until confronted. Kushinada-hime's survival signifies breaking the cycle, but only through external intervention. Susanoo and internal resilience, her willingness to marry the god, a symbolic act of reclaiming agency. The myth suggests healing isn't solitary. It requires both the storm and the survivor. Even the sake trap carries depth. Alcohol, in moderation, is a social lubricant, but in excess, it's a destructive force. Susanoo weaponizes Orochi's gluttony, turning its own appetite against it. Isn't that how we often battle our demons? We exploit their weaknesses, their predictability. The serpent's drunken stupor mirrors the way indulgence can render our inner monsters vulnerable, if only temporarily. The tale's enduring power lies in this duality. Susanoo isn't pure light slaying pure darkness. He's a fractured being who redeems himself by facing what he fears most, his own reflection in the serpent's eyes. When he pulls Kusanagi from Orochi's flesh, it's not just a victory, it's an acknowledgement that even the darkest parts of ourselves contain tools for transformation. The blade, like insight, is forged in the belly of the beast, and that's a battle worth fighting, whether you're a storm god or a mortal staring down your own 8-headed shadows. Susanoo's triumph over Orochi paints him as a redeemed hero, but shadows linger beneath that gleaming veneer. Before he ever set foot in Izumo, the storm god was heaven's problem child, a force of chaos who didn't just push boundaries but obliterated them. Picture this: celestial rice fields, painstakingly cultivated by Amaterasu's priests, reduced to mud under Susanoo's stampeding wrath. Sacred temples defiled with the carcass of a flayed horse, its blood splattered across silk banners. These weren't accidents, they were calculated outbursts, the tantrums of a god who refused to play by anyone's rules. The question isn't whether he saved Kushinada-hime, it's whether one act of valor absolves a lifetime of destruction. Modern readers might recognize something uncomfortably familiar in Susanoo's arc, the trope of the bad boy who reforms for love, but the myth doesn't offer easy answers. His rampage in heaven wasn't just mischief, it was systemic disrespect for order, a rejection of the very harmony Shinto holds sacred. When he ravaged Amaterasu's fields, he wasn't just attacking crops, he was spitting in the face of nourishment, stability, the social contract itself. The horse incident cuts deeper. In Shinto, horses were divine messengers and their ritual sacrifice was sacred. By slaughtering one violently and desecrating the temple, Susanoo didn't just break rules, he mocked the foundations of his culture. This wasn't rebellion, it was nihilism. Yet here's the paradox: the same impulsiveness that made him a menace in heaven becomes his greatest strength against Orochi. Where other gods might have hesitated, Susanoo acts deploying trickery, embracing risk, turning the serpent's gluttony against it. His flaws, once destructive, now fuel his cunning. But does that make him redeemed or just repurposed? The myth seems to wrestle with this itself. Unlike Western stories where heroes often earn clean slates, Susanoo's past isn't forgotten. Even after saving Izumo, he's never fully welcomed back into heaven's fold. His shrines remain earthly, his worship tinged with caution. The message is subtle but potent. Growth isn't about erasing your mistakes, but about wielding your strengths differently. Some scholars argue the tale critiques toxic masculinity, the god who only channels his aggression outward once he's given a damsel to protect. Others see a celebration of second chances, a reminder that even the wildest spirits can find purpose. Perhaps the truth lies in the cultural context. Shinto lacks the concept of permanent sin. Impurity, kegare, can be cleansed through ritual and action. Susanoo's battle with Orochi isn't just a fight, it's his harai, his great purification. The blood he spills isn't just the serpent's, it's the symbolic washing away of his own defilement. But redemption isn't linear. Notice how the legend lingers on his imperfections. When Susanoo gifts Kusanagi to Amaterasu, it's not a humble offering, it's a boast, a celestial "look what I did." His marriage to Kushinada-hime, while tender, still begins as a transaction. These nuances matter. They prevent him from becoming a sanitized hero, keeping him gloriously, frustratingly human. In the end, Susanoo isn't a cautionary tale or a role model, he's a mirror. We see our own capacity for both ruin and resilience, the storms we weather and the ones we unleash. And maybe that's the real lesson, not how to be perfect, but how to turn your chaos into something worth remembering. The Hime River doesn't just wind through Izumo, it coils like a serpent, its 8 major tributaries fanning out across the land like the grasping necks of Orochi itself. To stand at its banks during the rainy season is to witness something uncanny. The water surges violently, carving new channels overnight, as if the earth itself is being devoured by an invisible force. Local elders whisper that the river's capricious nature isn't just geology, it's memory, a remnant of the beast's death throes. After all, myth and geography often twist around each other like roots and soil. Could Orochi's 8 heads be a metaphor for the Hime's branching currents, each one swallowing villages when the floods come? Historical records lend eerie weight to this theory. Ancient Izumo chronicles speak of a catastrophic flood in the 3rd century, where the river split into multiple raging channels, sweeping away entire settlements. Survivors describe the disaster in vivid detail: water surging, like the lashing tongues of a great dragon, farms vanishing beneath the silt as if swallowed whole. Over generations, trauma transforms into narrative, the inexplicable becomes myth. The ritual sacrifices to Orochi maidens offered at the river's edge mirror real-life practices where communities, desperate to appease nature's fury, cast treasures or even effigies into treacherous waters. But the connection runs deeper than metaphor. Modern hydrologists mapping the Hime's ancient course discovered something striking. The river's oldest tributaries trace a pattern eerily reminiscent of 8-headed serpent art found on Jomon-era pottery. Even the name Orochi hints at this bond. Some scholars argue it derives from Orochi, an archaic term for destructive currents. The serpent's annual demand for sacrifices aligns with the region's seasonal floods, which typically peaked in autumn, the same time Kushinada-hime was meant to be offered. Coincidence or proof that myth is nature's shadow, cast long across human fear? Local flood legends add layers to this tapestry. In one village tale, a maiden named Taki-hime drowns herself in the Hime to stop its rampages, her hair tangling in the roots of riverside willows to bind the dragon's rage. In another, a blacksmith forges 8 iron stakes to pin the river's spirit to the riverbed, echoing Susanoo's decapitation of Orochi. These stories aren't just folklore, they're survival strategies, ways to make sense of a landscape that could turn lethal with a single storm. The real brilliance of the Orochi myth lies in its duality. It's both warning and reassurance. The monster can be outwitted. The floods, like the serpent, have a pattern, and patterns can be broken. Today, the Hime's banks bear quiet witness to this legacy. Stone markers etched with serpent motifs still dot the floodplains, their inscriptions urging travelers to beware the dragon's breath when rains loom. Fishermen avoid the deepest whirlpools, said to be where Orochi's heads once drank. And every October, when the water runs high, old women leave sake offerings at shrines, not to appease the serpent anymore, but to thank Susanoo for the lesson he etched into the land, that even the wildest forces can be met with cunning, and that rivers, like legends, never truly forget their shape. The Kusanagi sword isn't just a relic of myth. It's a living heartbeat in the discipline of Japanese martial arts, its legend etched into the very soul of kenjutsu. Walk into any traditional dojo today, and you'll feel its presence, not as a physical blade but as an ideal, the perfect fusion of spirit and steel. Warriors of old didn't just train to wield a sword. They sought to embody the same clarity Susanoo displayed when he pulled Kusanagi from Orochi's flesh, a moment where chaos was carved into order with a single decisive stroke. This ethos permeates Bushido, the warrior's code, where the sword is never merely a tool. It's a sacred trust, an extension of the self as deliberate as the breath that steadies a strike. Consider the ritual of tameshigiri, the art of test cutting. When a modern practitioner slices through rolled tatami mats, they're not just testing blade sharpness, they're channeling that mythical instant when Susanoo's sword cleaved through scales and destiny alike. The precision demanded mirrors the legend's lesson. A true cut isn't about force, but alignment of body, mind, and intent. Even the way katanas are traditionally forged, folded steel hammered thin to remove impurities, echoes Kusanagi's emergence from corruption. The sword was birthed from darkness, yet became a symbol of purity. So too does the martial artist refine themselves, strike by strike, until their technique is as flawless as the blade they revere. But Kusanagi's influence stretches beyond technique into philosophy. In the Hyoho Niiten Ikai Ryu school, founded by the legendary Miyamoto Musashi, students learn that the sword's greatest power lies in restraint, to draw it only when absolutely necessary, just as Susanoo wielded Kusanagi not for conquest but liberation. The Ido practice of slow, deliberate draws embodies this principle, transforming every motion into meditation. There's a reason dojos often display calligraphy of Katsujin Ken, that life-giving sword. It's a reminder that true mastery, like Susanoo's victory, isn't about domination but protection. The sword that slew Orochi became a gift to Amaterasu, a bridge between strife and harmony. Modern practitioners might never face an 8-headed serpent, but they grapple with their own Orochi distraction, ego, fear. The discipline of Kenjutsu, steeped in Kusanagi's legacy, teaches them to confront these beasts with the same strategic cunning Susanoo employed. Sparring becomes a dance of deception and adaptability, where feints mimic the sake trap that intoxicated the serpent. Even the kata, prescribed forms practiced solo, are more than rote movements. They're rituals of remembrance, each stance a whisper across centuries. This is how a god held his blade. This is how mortals learned to stand their ground. The most profound tribute, however, lies in the way Bushido intertwines swordplay with moral weight. To hold a katana is to accept Kenzen Ikenio, the unity of sword and goodness. When Susanoo gifted Kusanagi to Amaterasu, he didn't just offer a weapon, he returned balance to the cosmos. Similarly, in dojos from Kyoto to Tokyo, students bow not just to their sensei, but to the sword itself, acknowledging its dual nature as destroyer and protector. The scabbard is as revered as the blade, for sheathing it carries as much meaning as drawing it. This duality lives in every ray, every respectful salute, every oath to wield skill with compassion. Perhaps the ultimate testament to Kusanagi's legacy is how it transcends time. Today, when a kendoka shouts "men" and strikes for the head, they're not just targeting a helmet, they're reenacting Susanoo's decisive blow to Orochi's alpha head, the strike that ended the cycle of terror. The sword arts, in their relentless pursuit of perfection, keep the myth alive not as folklore but as a challenge. Can you transform your inner chaos into something as sharp, as purposeful, as the blade drawn from a serpent's tail? The answer, like the best cuts, leaves no room for hesitation. The name Yamata no Orochi rolls off the tongue with a weight that Orochi alone doesn't quite capture, and that extra syllable holds centuries of linguistic history. While most modern retellings simplify the beast's title to just Orochi, the full name appears in Japan's oldest written records, each version adding subtle shades of meaning. In the Kojiki, compiled in 712, the serpent is called Yamata no Orochi, with Yamata often interpreted as 8 forks, referencing its 8 heads and tails. But crack open the Nihon Shoki, finished just 8 years later, and you'll find it labeled Yamata no Orochi no Kami, the god of serpents. That tiny suffix transforms the creature from mere monster to something divine, a being worthy of both dread and reverence. Regional dialects further muddy the waters. In Izumo, where the legend is most deeply rooted, older folktales sometimes refer to the beast as Yaochi, a local twist on Yamata that hints at ancient pronunciation shifts. Meanwhile, shrine records in Shimain use Yamata no Orochi, swapping the ta for du, possibly reflecting an older word for a gate or portal, suggesting the serpent wasn't just a physical threat but a boundary between worlds. These variations aren't just academic, they reveal how the myth evolved as it traveled, adapting to the tongues and fears of each community it touched. The Kojiki and Nihon Shoki themselves tell subtly different tales. The Kojiki emphasizes Orochi's physicality, painting it as a tangible horror with eyes red as winter cherries and a body so vast it spanned valleys. The Nihon Shoki, meanwhile, leans into its supernatural aura, describing how its very breath-poisoned rivers, a detail absent from the earlier text. Scholars debate whether these differences reflect regional versions of the story or the agendas of their compilers. The Kojiki, meant to legitimize the imperial line, might have stripped Orochi of divinity to underscore Susanoo's heroism. The Nihon Shoki, with its stronger focus on Shinto ritual, could have amplified the serpent's sacred role to highlight the stakes of purification. Even the kanji used to write Orochi carry layers. The most common rendering, Chinese letter, means simply great serpent, but alternate spellings like Chinese letter, invoke images of pythons or dragons, while Chinese letter plays with puns, oro suggesting to twist and kai evoking blood. These choices aren't neutral, they shape how generations visualize the beast. A great serpent could be slain by a hero. A twisting blood god demands deeper confrontation. What emerges from these variations isn't confusion, but richness, a reminder that myths are living things, their names as fluid as the creatures they describe. Whether you call it Orochi, Yamata no Orochi, or something older and stranger, the serpent's power lingers in the syllables coiled and waiting. The tale of Susanoo and Orochi may be ancient, but its lessons thunder through the centuries with startling relevance, not as dusty moralizing, but as a playbook for navigating modern chaos. At its core, this isn't just a story about a god and a monster. It's a masterclass in strategy, resilience, and the messy, glorious work of transformation. Take Susanoo's approach to the battle. He doesn't rely on divine strength alone. Instead, he turns Orochi's own hunger against it, using sake as both weapon and mirror. There's profound wisdom here for anyone facing seemingly insurmountable challenges today. Whether it's corporate takeovers or personal setbacks, the myth whispers, study your opponent's weaknesses as closely as your own strength. The sake trap wasn't just clever, it was efficient, resourceful, and deeply respectful of the serpent's nature. Modern leaders could learn from this. Imagine applying that same principle to environmental crises, not fighting nature's fury with brute force, but redirecting its energy, working with tidal patterns or wildfire cycles rather than against them. Redemption arcs dominate our screens, but Susanoo's journey defies the trope. His transformation isn't sudden or linear. He stumbles from exile into purpose, his flaws becoming tools rather than burdens. That's the messy reality of growth. We rarely see the kind where anger, channeled wisely, fuels justice, and past mistakes inform future tactics. Therapists might call this shadow work. The myth simply shows it in action. When Susanoo kneels by the riverside with Kushinada-hime's family, he's not just pledging to fight Orochi, he's confronting the chaos he once embodied. Modern audiences wrestling with addiction, burnout, or self-sabotage might find unexpected solace here. The storm god's path suggests that healing isn't about erasing your scars but wielding them as compass points. Then there's the environmental parable coiled beneath the surface. Orochi isn't just a villain, it's the consequence of imbalance, a force that thrives on unchecked consumption. The villagers' annual sacrifices mirror humanity's own toxic cycles, exploiting resources until the land itself rebels. Susanoo's victory offers an alternative intervention that's both strategic and symbiotic. The sword pulled from Orochi's tail, Kusanagi, becomes a gift rather than a trophy. Its power returned to nurture rather than destroy. Indigenous land stewards have practiced this ethos for millennia, viewing nature not as an adversary to conquer, but as a partner to rebalance. In an era of climate crisis, the myth's insistence on clever coexistence over domination feels less like folklore and more like a survival manual. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is the power of the outsider's perspective. Susanoo succeeds where others failed precisely because he's fallen from grace. His exile grants him clarity, the ability to see Orochi not as an invincible terror, but as a beast with predictable appetites. Innovators from Silicon Valley to social movements echo this truth. Breakthroughs often come from those unburdened by conventional thinking. The myth invites us to embrace our own exile moments, career changes, failures, or cultural shifts as chances to spot the sake vats others overlook. After all, the storm god's greatest weapon wasn't his sword, but his willingness to kneel in the mud, listen to grieving farmers, and rethink what victory could mean. Susanoo's journey is one of the most striking transformations in mythology, not because he became perfect, but because he turned his flaws into weapons. Cast out of heaven, stripped of his divine prestige, he could have spent eternity drowning in bitterness. Instead, he stumbled upon something far more powerful than pride, purpose. In the tears of a grieving family, he found a reflection of his own exile, and in Orochi's monstrous hunger, a chance to channel his stormy nature toward something beyond himself. Think about that pivot, the moment a god known for destruction chose to protect. He didn't just slay a serpent, he reshaped his legacy, proving that even the most fractured among us can rewrite their story. What gives this myth its staying power isn't just the spectacle of divine combat, it's the messy, human heart beating beneath the legend. Susanoo isn't a golden hero, he's brash, impulsive, and deeply flawed. Yet his victory comes not in spite of these traits, but because of them. His cunning with the sake trap, that's the same trickster spirit that once ruined his sister's temples. His ferocity in battle, the same rage that got him exiled. The tale refuses to sanitize him, and that's why it resonates. We see ourselves in his stumbles and his second chances, the way failure can fertilize growth if we're bold enough to plant the seeds. The myth also taps into a universal truth. Monsters are rarely just monsters. Orochi isn't evil incarnate, it's a force of imbalance, a manifestation of what happens when hunger goes unchecked. In a world grappling with climate crises and unchecked consumption, the serpent feels eerily modern. Susanoo's solution, outsmarting rather than overpowering, offers a blueprint for confronting our own looming threats. The real magic lies in the aftermath. The sword pulled from Orochi's tail becomes a gift. The blood-soaked land eventually heals, and the god who was once a pariah becomes a protector. Redemption isn't about erasing the past, it's about composting it into something new. So here's the question the story leaves echoing: what's your Orochi? Not the abstract shadows we blame for the world's ills, but the personal beasts we feed with our silence, our excuses, our unexamined hungers, the ones coiled in the corners of our lives, demanding sacrifices, time, joy, potential, one piece at a time. Susanoo's tale whispers that confrontation isn't about waiting for divine intervention. It's about spotting the sake vats hidden in plain sight, the leverage points where our weaknesses can become our strategies. The storm god's greatest victory wasn't wielding a sword, it was learning to wield himself. If this journey through myth has sparked your curiosity, don't let it end here. Smash that like button if you dare to face your own 8-headed challenge, and drop a comment below. What's the Orochi you're ready to outsmart? Subscribe for more deep dives into legends that don't just entertain, they illuminate. After all, the oldest stories often hold the sharpest mirrors. What will you see reflect?